Hi, welcome back. For the first time, if you look behind me, you can see I've got something slightly different on my work table today. And that's because I want to very specifically look at how variegated or hand-painted yarns behave in our weaving. So let's start off with this piece that I've got on the little stand here. This is a piece woven with the Ashford caterpillar cotton, which is a variegated cotton yarn. It's an absolutely beautiful yarn and it's lovely to use. What I did when I wove this sample was I put up a section of white warp, a section of royal blue warp, and a section of the caterpillar cotton in the warp. And I did this for two reasons. First of all, to show you how a variegated yarn reacts against a variegated yarn when you use it in warp and weft. And you can see, if you just look at that section, we get this absolutely delightful kind of crazy log cabin sort of broken geometrical effect. And it can be really, really attractive if you use a variegated yarn on top of a variegated yarn. If you use any yarn with white, what happens is, whether it's a variegated yarn or whether it's just a different color of yarn, think of it in terms of mixing paints on a palette, as you would if you were an artist, where if you add white into the mix, it just makes everything a little bit more pale. And if you add a dark color into the mix, it makes everything a little bit more intense. So I'm not saying that the pale is a bad option or the more intense is a better option. Definitely not saying that at all. There is always a case for a more gentle color combination or a case for a stronger color combination. But it just does us a lot of good as weavers to take into account the fact that when we marry our weft into our warp, what is happening is we are actually blending colors. It's not like knitting where your colors would be one color next to another color, or crochet, think in terms of crocheting granny squares or something like that, where one color sits next to the other color. If you're weaving on a balanced weave structure, then you have to think in terms of blending your colors. So that's the first thing I want to show you. The second part of the exercise involves these samples down here. Okay. So what we have here is a selection of kind of, let's call them partners. This selection of samples came about because I taught a workshop recently where somebody had a very beautiful variegated yarn, and they had put it up in the warp and they had woven over the variegated yarn in the warp with a very pale weft, and they were devastated because the variegated yarn had disappeared. So in the top little series of sections, I've got, as you can see, I've left the fringes on so that you can see exactly what I've got there. I've woven with the variegated yarn on top of a plain warp. In the bottom series of samples, I've woven with a plain weft on top of a variegated warp. And this is where we kind of face a bit of a weaver's conundrum, really, because we are working on a balanced weave structure here where we're seeing ostensibly 50% warp and 50% weft. But if you look at the sample where I've woven with the variegated color on a white warp and a white warp on a variegated weft, you can see how visually, and it's an optical illusion actually, if you use your variegated yarn in the weft as opposed to using it in the warp and weaving over it with the plain weft, it becomes far more visible. And this particular sample, this sort of white on white combination, was quite an eye-opener for me because I didn't realize just how much of a difference there would be. And it purely and simply, as I said, is an optical illusion where your weft is optically more dominant than your warp. So that was the first thing. When I used the sort of the mid-purple, which is one of this kind of pale mauve, lilac, whatever you want to call it, which is one of the colors that occurs in the variegated yarn, the difference between using the variegate in the warp and using it in the weft was much less, but still the variegate is more visible if you use it in the weft. Of course, on our dark warp and with our dark weft, immediately the lighter colors of the variegate kind of pop out, but still more dominant where we've used it in the weft, and the same with the darker one. The last color section, these little blues that I have over here, that was purely and simply to see what would happen if I used the variegated yarn with a totally unrelated color. And as far as I'm concerned, the result was inconspicuous in the extreme. But the point that I'm making here is just be very careful how you use your variegated yarns. Our hand-painted skeins and our variegated skeins are so precious, and we really want to show them off to the best advantage possible. This batch of samples was the result of a lesson hard learnt, and I really very, very strongly recommend that if you are going to use a special yarn, whether it's a hand-painted or hand-dyed yarn or even a hand-spun yarn, and we know how precious these are, and we really want to show them off to the best of their to their best advantage, but we also don't want to waste them. This is one of those instances where I would say, please sample. Please just sacrifice a tiny bit of that yarn and make a sample with it. It could save you a lot of heartache. I hope this helped. It's not a very practical weaving tip, but it certainly is a very practical outcomes-based tip. So, as I say, don't be afraid to sample, even if it means using up some of that really, really special yarn. It's not a waste. Sampling like this tells you that you're on the right track. That's fantastic. If it tells you that you're on the wrong track, that's even better, because it stops you from wasting all of that beautiful yarn.